For decades, military archives kept this story in complete secrecy. None of the soldiers who participated wanted to talk about what really happened that night in Monte Cassino. But today, you'll discover why. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more daily documentaries. Ready? Now turn up the volume and let's begin. The cold winter of 1944 had settled across the Italian countryside with unusual bitterness. The mountains of central Italy, already imposing and treacherous, had become nearly impassable as snow and ice claimed the narrow paths that wound through the valleys. It was here, in this unforgiving terrain, that the 92nd Infantry Division of the United States Army, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, found themselves facing not only the entrenched German forces, but also the skepticism and derision of their Italian adversaries. Lieutenant Colonel James Fowler of the 371st Infantry Regiment sat in his makeshift command post, a damaged farmhouse just south of the Gustav Line. The walls still bore the scars of artillery, and the roof leaked when it rained, which it did frequently that January. A single oil lamp cast long shadows across his face as he reviewed the latest intelligence reports. The Buffalo Soldiers had been in Italy for 4 months, but this would be their first major offensive operation. Fowler knew what his men were capable of, but he also understood the weight of history that bore down on them. "They're saying it again," Captain Richard Wilson said as he entered the room, his breath visible in the cold air. "The Italian radio broadcasts, they're mocking our men." Fowler didn't look up from his maps. "What are they saying this time? That America must be desperate to send its... Well, I won't repeat their exact words, sir. But they're suggesting that our men don't have the courage or the intelligence to succeed where white units have failed." Now Fowler looked up, his expression hardened by months of hearing similar sentiments, sometimes from his own side. The 92nd was an all-black division, one of only 2 in the entire United States Army permitted to serve in combat during World War II. Their very presence on European soil was historic, but history had not been kind to them thus far. "Let them talk," Fowler said finally. "Words don't win wars." What neither man knew as they spoke was that a document had already been prepared, one that would soon arrive at their command post. A document that contained orders that would send hundreds of men into one of the most controversial operations of the Italian campaign. An operation that would remain classified for decades, not because of its military significance, but because of what it revealed about the war that was fought within the war. The battle against prejudice that raged even as Americans died on foreign soil. That same evening, across enemy lines, Italian Colonel Marco Esposito sat in his own command bunker, reinforced with concrete and steel, a stark contrast to the crumbling farmhouse used by the Americans. He was meeting with German liaison officer Major Klaus Weber, both men reviewing the latest intelligence on American troop movements. "They're bringing up the 92nd, Weber said, his tone neutral but his implication clear. Esposito allowed himself a small, dismissive smile. "The Africans. Perhaps the Americans have run out of real soldiers." Weber didn't share the Italians' amusement. "Don't underestimate them. They fight to prove something, which can make them dangerous." Esposito waved his hand, as if brushing away an irritating insect. "My dear Weber, I've read the reports from North Africa. These men break under pressure. They lack discipline, courage. They are not like European soldiers. Neither are the Japanese," Weber replied pointedly. "Yet they fight with remarkable determination." Esposito ignored the comparison. "In any case, they won't break through our positions. The terrain favors the defender, and winter favors the prepared. We are both." What neither officer realized was that their conversation was being recorded by Italian partisan Sofia Lombardi, who had infiltrated the base as a clerical worker. Her small recording device, provided by the Office of Strategic Services, captured every word of their disdain. This recording would eventually find its way to American intelligence officers, and years later into historical archives, where it would provide a rare glimpse into the mindset of those who had so gravely underestimated the men they faced. In the valleys below the mountain positions, the men of Company B, 371st Infantry Regiment, conducted final equipment checks. Sergeant Marcus Johnson, a former schoolteacher from Detroit, Michigan, moved among his squad, checking weapons, ammunition, and cold weather gear. Despite the freezing temperatures, Johnson moved with purpose and energy, his quiet confidence inspiring the younger soldiers around him. Private First Class Thomas Washington, barely 19 years old, and from the warm climate of Mississippi, struggled to keep his hands warm enough to disassemble and clean his M1 Garand rifle. "Keep moving your fingers," Johnson advised, "and keep this close to your body tonight. Cold weapon means jams tomorrow." Washington nodded, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Sarge, is it true what they're saying about the Italian broadcasts?" Johnson paused, considering his response carefully. "There's always talk, Washington. Before this, it was posters in Naples warning Italian women about us. Before that, it was our own transportation officers refusing to give us rides to the front. Words are just air." "But they don't think we can fight," Washington pressed. Johnson looked directly at the young private. "Then they haven't been paying attention to history. Our people have been fighting since Crispus Attucks took a British bullet in Boston, fighting for a country that doesn't always fight for us." He resumed his inspection. "Tomorrow, they'll learn what we already know." What Johnson didn't tell Washington was that he had seen the preliminary operations plan. Their company would be at the spearhead of the attack, advancing up terrain that had already claimed hundreds of lives in previous attempts by other units. Whether this assignment was a vote of confidence or an expectation of failure, Johnson couldn't be sure. But he knew his men would do their duty either way. As night fell, the temperature dropped further. In their foxholes and makeshift shelters, the men of the 92nd tried to rest, knowing that before dawn they would begin an assault that many thought impossible. Some wrote letters home, careful not to include details that might worry their families or alert censors. Others cleaned their weapons again and again, a ritual that provided both practical benefit and psychological comfort. A few prayed silently, their lips moving in the darkness. Captain Wilson made his way through the company positions, speaking briefly with squad leaders, offering encouragement where needed and addressing concerns where possible. When he reached Johnson's position, he crouched down beside the sergeant. "Final briefing at 0300 hours, Wilson said quietly. "New intelligence has come in. Might change our approach." Johnson nodded. "We'll be ready, sir." Wilson hesitated, then added, "Command is sending an observer, colonel from Army headquarters." Johnson understood the implication immediately. Their performance would be evaluated not just on military objectives achieved, but as a reflection on all black soldiers. "Nothing new there, sir. We're always being watched." Wilson placed a hand briefly on Johnson's shoulder, then moved on to the next position. As he disappeared into the darkness, Johnson looked up at the clouded sky, no stars visible through the winter overcast. By this time tomorrow, he thought, some of his men would be dead. Others would have proven themselves in ways that would never make the newspapers back home. And some perhaps would have changed minds. What none of them knew was that 12 miles away, in a heavily camouflaged position, the 58th Panzer Corps was preparing a counterattack of its own. Intelligence had failed on both sides, setting the stage for an encounter that neither had fully anticipated. As Johnson finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, the document that would change everything was making its final journey to Lieutenant Colonel Fowler's command post. The motorcycle courier navigated the treacherous mountain roads with only minimal headlights, aware that any German spotter would immediately call in artillery on such an obvious target. The sealed orders he carried would arrive just in time for the 3 a.m. briefing, their contents unknown even to the high-ranking officers who would soon implement them. The stage was set for what historians would later call one of the most remarkable yet overlooked engagements of the Italian campaign. An engagement that would remain classified not for its tactical innovations or strategic importance, but for what it revealed about the United States military's treatment of its own soldiers. A revelation that would wait decades before finally emerging from dusty archives and forgotten testimonies. The truth about what happened when Italian commanders mocked black troops, only to watch their tanks burn before dawn. In the pre-dawn darkness of February 3rd, 1944, the men of the 371st Infantry Regiment assembled in small groups, their faces barely visible in the dim light of shielded flashlights. The new orders had arrived, and they were unlike anything Lieutenant Colonel Fowler had expected. Instead of a frontal assault on the heavily defended mountain position, they were to execute a flanking maneuver through terrain considered impassable. A narrow ravine that twisted between two ridgelines, undefended because the Italian and German commanders believed no military force could navigate it successfully. Major Robert Davis, the observer sent from Army headquarters, stood silently at the edge of the command group, his expression unreadable. He had arrived just 2 hours earlier, awakening Fowler from his brief rest with credentials that indicated he answered directly to General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army. His presence added another layer of pressure to an already tense situation. "Gentlemen," Fowler began, his voice low but clear, "the operation has changed. Intelligence has identified a potential weakness in the enemy line. We will exploit it while the rest of the division conducts diversionary actions along the main approach." Captain Wilson unfolded a map on the hood of a jeep, weighing down the corners with stones. "The ravine runs here, between these two ridges. It's narrow, steep, and according to local guides, treacherous even in good weather. In winter conditions," he let the implication hang in the air. "Why us?" Lieutenant Jackson asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Fowler glanced briefly at Major Davis before answering. "Because no one would expect it, because it's believed impossible, and because if we succeed, we'll be behind their lines with access to their command and control elements, artillery positions, and supply routes." What Fowler didn't say, but what everyone understood, was that if they failed, the losses would be attributed to the perceived limitations of black troops rather than the extraordinary difficulty of the mission. Sergeant Johnson studied the map intently. The ravine was barely visible on the military charts, little more than a crease between contour lines. "We'll need local guides," he said finally. "Already arranged," Wilson replied. "2 Italian partisans who grew up in these mountains. They'll meet us at the jump-off point." The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering communications plans, rally points, and contingencies. Throughout, Major Davis remained silent, observing but not participating. When Fowler finally asked if there were any questions, Davis spoke for the first time. "Gentlemen, I'll be accompanying your lead elements." His accent marked him as from somewhere in the northeastern United States, his manner that of a career officer. "My role is to observe and report directly to General Clark. I will not be in your chain of command, nor will I interfere with your operations. Consider me invisible." The officers exchanged glances. Having a high-ranking observer in the middle of a dangerous operation was the last thing they needed, but none would voice this concern openly. "We move out in 30 minutes, Fowler concluded. "Good luck." As the officers dispersed to their respective units, the sky to the east showed no hint of the coming dawn. Clouds hung low and heavy, promising more snow before the day was done. The weather that had made the ravine route seem impossible might now prove their greatest ally, concealing their movement from enemy observation. At the Italian-German command post, Colonel Esposito awoke to the sound of distant artillery. The expected American assault was right on schedule, focusing on the main defensive positions as anticipated. He dressed quickly and made his way to the command bunker, where operations officers were already tracking the situation. "Status?" he demanded as he entered. Major Weber, who appeared not to have slept at all, pointed to the map. American artillery began at 0500 hours. Their infantry is advancing here, here, and here, all predictable axes of attack. Esposito nodded with satisfaction. And the 92nd, engaged along this sector. Weber indicated a stretch of the front where the terrain was particularly difficult. They're making no progress. What neither officer knew was that while elements of the 92nd were indeed visible on that sector, Company B and two other companies had slipped away in the darkness, already an hour into their traverse of the supposedly impassable ravine. The ravine was everything the maps had suggested, and worse. Narrow in places that men had to move sideways, steep enough in others that they used ropes to descend safely, and treacherous throughout with ice that had formed on rock faces and in crevices. The two partisan guides, brothers named Antonio and Giuseppe Ricci, moved with the confidence of men who had grown up in these mountains, but even they proceeded with caution. Sergeant Johnson and his squad were third in the order of march, following Lieutenant Jackson's platoon headquarters and another squad. Behind them stretched a line of soldiers that disappeared around the twists and turns of the ravine. They moved in silence, broken only by the occasional whispered warning about a difficult section ahead or the muffled sound of equipment shifting. Private Washington slipped on a patch of ice, nearly falling, before Johnson caught his arm. "Steady," the sergeant whispered. "One step at a time." Washington nodded his thanks, his face tight with concentration. The young man from Mississippi had never seen mountains before joining the army, let alone navigated them in winter conditions under combat circumstances. Yet he moved forward with determination, understanding the historic nature of their mission. 2 hours into their march, the lead elements reached a section where the ravine widened briefly before narrowing again. Antonio Ricci, the older of the two partisan brothers, held up a hand, signaling the column to halt. He moved forward cautiously, then quickly retreated to where Captain Wilson waited. "There is a problem," Antonio whispered in accented English. "German patrol, small, maybe 3 men. They have stopped in the wider section ahead. They have a radio." Wilson processed this information quickly. A German patrol with a radio presented a serious threat to their entire operation. If they reported the American presence in the ravine, the element of surprise would be lost. "Are they alert?" Wilson asked. Antonio shook his head. "They make fire, small fire. They think they are safe here." Wilson motioned for Lieutenant Jackson and Sergeant Johnson to join them. After explaining the situation, he asked, "Options?" "We can't go back," Jackson said immediately, "and we can't go around. We have to take them quietly," Johnson added. "No shots if possible." Wilson nodded. "Johnson, your squad. 3 men only, knives and garrots. No firearms unless absolutely necessary." Johnson selected his 3 most experienced men, leaving Washington and the others with instructions to secure their position. The 4 soldiers removed anything that might make noise, even taping down equipment that couldn't be left behind. They blackened their faces with mud from the ravine walls, making themselves nearly invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. With Antonio Ricci leading them, the small team moved forward, each step carefully placed to avoid dislodging rocks or breaking the thin crust of ice that had formed in places. As they approached the wider section, they could smell the faint odor of cigarette smoke and hear low voices speaking German. The German patrol had indeed grown complacent, believing themselves safe in this supposedly inaccessible location. They had established a small fire, shielded from observation from above, and were heating rations while maintaining only the most cursory watch. Their radio sat on a flat rock, occasional static crackling from its speaker. Johnson signaled his men to spread out, each targeting a specific German soldier. They would strike simultaneously, eliminating the threat before any alarm could be raised. For a moment, Johnson was transported back to his classroom in Detroit, wondering what his students would think if they could see their teacher now, preparing to kill other human beings in a foreign land. The thought passed quickly, replaced by the cold focus needed for the task at hand. The attack, when it came, was swift and nearly silent. 3 German soldiers died without raising an alarm, their bodies carefully hidden among rocks at the edge of the wider section. The 4th American, Corporal Lewis, secured the radio, ensuring it was intact for potential intelligence value. As the rest of the company filed through the wider section, now moving at a faster pace with the immediate threat eliminated, Major Davis appeared beside Johnson. He had witnessed the entire action from nearby. "Efficiently done, Sergeant," Davis said quietly, his expression neutral. Johnson couldn't tell if the comment was genuine approval or mere observation. "Thank you, sir." "Have you seen combat before this campaign?" Davis asked. "North Africa, sir. With the 366th, Davis nodded. "I reviewed some after-action reports from that theater. Mixed conclusions about the performance of Negro units." Johnson met the Major's gaze directly. "Depends who wrote the reports, sir." For a moment tension hung between them, then Davis's expression softened slightly. "Yes, I suppose it does." He moved ahead, leaving Johnson to wonder about the true purpose of the Major's presence. By 0700 hours, the lead elements of the 3 companies had navigated approximately 2/3 of the ravine. Above them, the main battle raged along the conventional approaches, with artillery and mortar fire creating a continuous background of distant thunder. So far, their flanking movement remained undetected. At the Italian-German command post, however, the first hints of concern were beginning to emerge. Colonel Esposito frowned at the battle maps, where the American attacks were proceeding exactly as expected, with one exception. "The attacks lack conviction," he said to Weber. "They push, but not with full strength, almost as if they're a diversion," Weber finished the thought. Esposito's frown deepened. "But a diversion for what? There is no other approach, unless—" His finger traced the map, stopping at the ravine. "Could they possibly—" Weber shook his head. "Impossible. We've sent our own patrols through in better weather. The terrain is impassable for a military unit." "Still," Esposito insisted, "send a reconnaissance aircraft. Low level, following the ravine line. Let's be certain." As Weber left to arrange the reconnaissance flight, Esposito remained staring at the map. If Americans were somehow navigating the ravine, they would emerge less than 2 kilometers from the command post and directly behind the positions of the Italian 18th Artillery Regiment, whose guns were currently engaged in countering the American diversionary attacks. The thought was disturbing enough that Esposito decided to implement precautionary measures. He issued orders for a reserve company of Italian infantry and 2 Panzer IV tanks to establish positions covering the ravine exit as a prudent security measure. He specifically did not mention his concerns about the 92nd Infantry Division, not wanting to appear alarmed by the prospect of black American troops outmaneuvering him. This decision, made almost as an afterthought, would prove pivotal in the coming hours. As the sky lightened marginally behind the heavy cloud cover, the men of Company B and the other companies continued their arduous journey through the ravine. They were tired, cold, and now moving through an area where melting snow from above had created a shallow stream along the ravine floor, soaking their boots and increasing the risk of frostbite. Yet morale remained high. They had accomplished what was thought impossible, and the promise of striking the enemy from an unexpected direction energized them despite their physical discomfort. What they didn't know was that a German reconnaissance aircraft was now airborne, heading toward their position with specific orders to examine the ravine they had been assured was impassable. The clock was ticking on their element of surprise, the most valuable asset in their ambitious operation. In the Italian artillery positions, gunners worked methodically, firing their 105mm howitzers at coordinates provided by forward observers. The guns had been firing for hours, their crews well practiced in maintaining a steady rate of fire without exhausting themselves or their ammunition supply. They had no reason to believe they were in any danger, positioned as they were well behind the front lines. Their commander, Major Benedetto Rossi, supervised from a command post established in what had once been a small chapel. The stone walls provided protection from shell fragments and the elements, while offering a clear view of the battery positions. Rossi was proud of his men and their contribution to holding the American forces at bay. Like many Italian officers, he had mixed feelings about the German alliance, but no doubts about defending Italian soil from invaders. When a messenger arrived with orders to be alert for possible enemy infiltration from the ravine area, Rossi initially dismissed the warning as excessive caution. However, military discipline prevailed, and he assigned a platoon to establish observation posts overlooking the ravine exit, more as a formality than out of genuine concern. This half-hearted response to a warning that should have been taken more seriously would soon have consequences that would echo through military history. At approximately 0830 hours, the first elements of Company B emerged from the ravine into a wooded area that provided concealment from casual observation. Captain Wilson consulted with the partisan guides, confirming their location relative to the Italian artillery positions. They were, incredibly, right where they needed to be, behind enemy lines, undetected, and in position to strike at a critical enemy asset. Lieutenant Colonel Fowler, who had accompanied the lead elements despite the risks, gathered his company commanders for a final briefing before the attack. Major Davis stood nearby, silent but attentive, his notebook in hand. "We have achieved the impossible," Fowler said, his voice betraying his fatigue, but also his pride. "Now comes the critical phase. Captain Wilson, your company will take the artillery positions from the rear. Captain Reynolds, secure the road junction to prevent reinforcements from reaching them. Captain Harris, establish blocking positions between the artillery and the main enemy line." The officers nodded, each understanding their role in the complex operation. They had rehearsed this plan repeatedly before departure, but now it would be executed under real conditions, with real consequences for any mistakes. "Communications?" Fowler asked. "Radio check complete," the communications officer reported. "We have contact with division headquarters. They're aware we've reached our position and are standing by for our signal to intensify the frontal attacks. Timeline? Your hour in 30 minutes. 0900 hours. Fowler looked at each of his officers in turn. "Gentlemen, what we do in the next hour will change the course of this campaign. More importantly, it will change perceptions. Execute your orders with precision and determination." He checked his watch. "Synchronize watches. We attack in 30 minutes. As the officers dispersed to their units, Major Davis approached Fowler. "Impressive navigation, Colonel. I wouldn't have believed it possible if I hadn't seen it myself." Fowler accepted the compliment with a nod. "The men performed admirably." "Indeed," Davis agreed. "I'll be with Captain Wilson's company for the main assault. I want to observe the artillery position capture firsthand." "As you wish, Major, but stay clear of the actual fighting. We can't have you becoming a casualty." Davis smiled slightly. "I assure you, Colonel, I have no intention of becoming a statistic in your operation." What neither officer knew was that at that moment, the German reconnaissance aircraft was flying directly above them, hidden from their view by the thick forest canopy, but its pilot clearly observing the tracks leading from the ravine exit into the woods. Tracks that could only have been made by a significant number of men moving in formation. The pilot immediately radioed his findings, and the report quickly reached Colonel Esposito's headquarters. The Italian officer's face darkened as he received the confirmation of his fears. "How many men?" he demanded. "The pilot estimates a battalion-sized element," came the reply, "moving toward the artillery positions." Esposito issued orders immediately, directing the reserve company and the 2 Panzer IV tanks to move at maximum speed to reinforce the artillery positions. He also attempted to contact Major Rossi directly, but communications were intermittent due to the effects of the ongoing battle. "Which American unit?" Esposito asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Unclear, Colonel. But the pilot reported seeing Negro soldiers among those visible in clearings. Esposito's expression hardened. The 92nd, they've actually done it. Despite his previous dismissive attitude, he was professional enough to recognize the achievement. "Get me Major Weber immediately." When the German liaison officer arrived moments later, Esposito pointed to the map. "They've flanked us through the ravine, a significant force, already in position to strike the 18th Artillery." Weber absorbed this information with characteristic German stoicism. The tanks and reserve company? En route, but they'll be cutting it close. If they take those artillery positions, our entire defensive line becomes untenable, Weber noted. Esposito nodded grimly. "I know, we've underestimated them, it seems." "Not them," Weber corrected, "the 92nd specifically. The unit you were so dismissive of yesterday." Esposito had no response to this pointed reminder of his prejudiced assumptions. Instead, he focused on the immediate tactical problem, issuing orders to reorganize their defenses to account for the threat now materializing behind their lines. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the military capabilities of the Buffalo Soldiers, but also the deeply entrenched assumptions about their worth as fighting men. In less than 30 minutes, the attack would begin. And by day's end, burning tanks would indeed stand as testament to courage that transcended the artificial boundaries of race. Are you following along so far? Help us bring this story to more people. Like the video, comment if you already knew about this case, and subscribe to the channel. Now we return to the point where everything changed. At precisely 0900 hours, the men of Company B, 371st Infantry Regiment, began their assault on the Italian artillery positions. They moved through the woods in dispersed formation, using the trees for cover as they closed in on their objective. The Italian artillerymen, focused on their ongoing fire mission, remained unaware of the threat approaching from their rear. Sergeant Johnson led his squad toward the leftmost gun position, where 4 105mm howitzers were firing at a steady pace. He signaled his men to deploy into their assault positions, each soldier finding cover behind trees or in shallow depressions. Private Washington, despite his youth and inexperience, moved with newfound confidence, positioning himself exactly where Johnson had indicated. Captain Wilson and Major Davis observed from a position that offered a clear view of the entire battery. Wilson raised his binoculars, confirming that all elements were in position. "Begin on my signal," he spoke quietly into his radio. 3, 2, 1, execute. The first indication the Italian artillerymen had of the attack was the distinctive sound of M1 Garand rifles firing in disciplined volleys. Several gunners fell immediately, while others scrambled for cover or for their own weapons. The artillery officers shouted orders, trying to organize a defense, but they were facing an enemy from an unexpected direction, and confusion reigned. Johnson's squad advanced by fire and movement, 2 men providing covering fire, while others moved forward, then alternating roles. They closed rapidly on their assigned howitzer position, eliminating resistance with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, they had secured their objective and were preparing the gun for destruction. Across the battery, similar scenes played out as the Buffalo Soldiers systematically neutralized the Italian resistance. Their months of training, combined with the element of surprise, gave them an overwhelming advantage despite being roughly equal in numbers to the defending force. Major Rossi, the Italian battery commander, was among the first casualties, shot twice as he attempted to rally his men. With his death, organized resistance within the battery collapsed, and within 20 minutes of the initial assault, all 12 howitzers were in American hands. Major Davis moved forward once the shooting had largely stopped, observing as the American soldiers secured prisoners and began placing demolition charges on the artillery pieces. His expression remained professional, but those who glanced at him might have noticed a new respect in his eyes. "Impressive work, Captain," he said to Wilson. "Textbook execution." Wilson nodded. too focused on consolidating their gains to fully register the compliment. "We're not done yet. We need to prepare for the counterattack. It will come soon." As if summoned by his words, the sound of tank engines became audible in the distance. The Italian reserve force was approaching, including the 2 Panzer IV tanks that Colonel Esposito had positioned as a precaution. "Johnson," Wilson called, "enemy armor approaching. Get your bazooka teams in position along the access road." Johnson acknowledged the order and quickly organized his anti-tank assets. The M9 bazooka was a relatively new weapon in the American arsenal, capable of penetrating the armor of most Axis tanks if used correctly. Johnson positioned his 2 bazooka teams where they would have clear shots at the approaching tanks, with riflemen providing protection against enemy infantry. Private Washington found himself assigned as an ammunition carrier for one of the bazooka teams, responsible for loading the second rocket tube, while the gunner fired the first. It was a position of significant responsibility for such a young soldier, but Johnson had seen something in Washington that suggested he would perform well under pressure. The 1st Panzer IV became visible through the trees, moving cautiously along the narrow access road. Behind it came Italian infantry, using the tank for cover as they advanced. The 2nd tank followed approximately 50 yards behind, creating a formidable assault force. "Hold fire," Johnson instructed his men. "Let them get closer. Aim for the side armor, not the front." The tanks continued their advance, now less than 200 yards from the American positions. The Italian infantry were visible now, moving in disciplined formations alongside their armored support. These were not second-rate troops, but experienced soldiers who had fought throughout the Mediterranean theater. "Stand by," Johnson said, his voice steady. "Bazooka teams, fire when ready." The first rocket launched with a distinctive whoosh, leaving a trail of smoke as it streaked toward the lead tank. It struck just below the turret, where the armor was thinnest, and exploded in a flash of light and concussion. The tank immediately halted, smoke pouring from its hatches, but its main gun remained operational and swiveled toward the source of the attack. The 2nd bazooka team fired moments later, their rocket striking the same tank, but failing to penetrate its armor. The tank's main gun fired in response, the shell exploding among the trees near Johnson's position, showering the Americans with splinters and debris, but causing no casualties. Washington worked with focused intensity, loading the 2nd rocket tube for his bazooka gunner, Corporal Martinez. His hands were steady despite the chaos around him, his movements precise as he'd been trained. "Ready," he called to Martinez. The 2nd shot from their position struck the lead tank's track, immobilizing it completely, but still leaving its gun operational. The tank commander, recognizing his vulnerability, ordered his crew to continue fighting rather than attempting to escape the disabled vehicle. The 2nd Panzer IV accelerated, trying to maneuver around its disabled companion and close distance with the American positions. As it did, it presented its side armor to the other American bazooka team, which fired again. This time, the rocket struck perfectly, penetrating the tank's armor and igniting its ammunition. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, the tank's turret actually lifting slightly from its mounting as flames erupted from every hatch and opening. The Italian infantry, now deprived of half their armored support and facing concentrated rifle fire from the American positions, began to waver. Their officer rallied them briefly, organizing a charge toward the nearest American squad, but the Buffalo soldiers held firm, their fire disciplined and effective. Johnson directed his riflemen to concentrate on the attacking infantry, while the bazooka teams reloaded to engage the remaining tank. The battlefield was now filled with smoke, the reports of rifles and the occasional larger blast, when the tank fired its main gun. Major Davis had taken cover behind a fallen tree, close enough to observe the action, but not so close as to be in immediate danger. He watched as the black soldiers responded to the counterattack with professional skill and courage, exactly as white soldiers would in the same situation. It was perhaps an obvious observation, but one that many in the military establishment still struggled to accept. Washington and Martinez were preparing to fire again when the disabled tank's main gun found its range. A high explosive shell detonated just 10 yards from their position, the concussion throwing both men to the ground. Martinez lay motionless, blood seeping from multiple wounds caused by shell fragments. Washington, dazed but conscious, pulled himself to his knees and then to the bazooka, which miraculously remained intact. Johnson saw what was happening and moved toward Washington's position, dodging from cover to cover as machine gun fire from the tank swept the area. "Can you fire it?" he shouted as he reached Washington. The young private nodded, though blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. "Yes, Sergeant. But I need a loader." Johnson immediately took up the loader's position, preparing the rocket as Washington adjusted his aim. The tank was now firing continuously, its machine guns sweeping the American positions while its main gun sought targets for its more devastating shells. "Now!" Washington called, and Johnson loaded the rocket. Washington aimed carefully, compensating for distance and the angle of the tank's armor. When he fired, the rocket streaked true, striking the tank at the junction of its turret and hull. The explosion was followed by secondary detonations as the tank's ammunition cooked off. Within moments, flames engulfed the vehicle, and its crew attempted to escape through the hatches, only to be cut down by rifle fire from the American positions. With both tanks destroyed and their supporting infantry in retreat, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Johnson helped Washington to safety, where a medic attended to his wounds while other soldiers secured the area and tended to the more seriously injured. Captain Wilson approached with Major Davis, both men surveying the battlefield where the smoking ruins of 2 German-made tanks now testified to the success of the operation. "Casualty report?" Wilson asked. 8 wounded, 3 seriously," came the reply from his executive officer. 2 confirmed KIA. Wilson nodded grimly. Even successful operations exacted a price in blood. "The artillery?" "Demolition charges set on all pieces, ready to detonate on your command." "Execute," Wilson ordered. "We need to begin our withdrawal soon. Our diversion on the main front won't keep the Germans occupied indefinitely." As the demolition teams prepared to destroy the captured howitzers, Major Davis approached Sergeant Johnson and Private Washington, who was now bandaged, but insisting he could still perform his duties. "Sergeant," Davis acknowledged Johnson, then turned to Washington. "Private, that was exceptional shooting." Washington straightened despite his injuries. "Thank you, sir. Where did you learn to fire a bazooka with that level of accuracy?" "Fort Huachuca, sir, but mostly from Sergeant Johnson. He made us practice until we could hit a target in our sleep." Davis nodded, then addressed Johnson. "Your men performed admirably, Sergeant. All of them." Johnson met the Major's gaze. "They're good soldiers, sir, always have been." "Yes," Davis agreed, and something in his tone suggested a perspective shifted. "I believe they are." The series of explosions that destroyed the Italian artillery pieces signaled the completion of their primary mission objective. Lieutenant Colonel Fowler issued orders for the withdrawal, which would take place along a different route than their approach. Intelligence from the partisan guides indicated a less treacherous path that would allow them to rejoin the main American forces by nightfall. As they prepared to move out, the soldiers of Company B could hear the sounds of renewed fighting from the main front, where their division counterparts had intensified their attacks as planned upon receiving word of the successful raid. The diversionary action was now serving its second purpose, covering the withdrawal of the flanking force. Captain Wilson found a moment to speak privately with Major Davis as they prepared to depart. "Will your report reflect what you saw here today, Major?" Davis considered the question before answering. "My report will reflect exactly what occurred, Captain. American soldiers executing their mission with courage and skill." He paused, then added, "The color of those soldiers will be noted as a matter of record, but not as a qualifier to their performance." Wilson nodded. understanding that in the context of 1944, this represented a significant concession from an officer of Davis's rank and position. What neither man could have anticipated was that Major Davis's report would indeed be filed, classified, and then effectively buried in the larger narratives of the Italian campaign. The operation that had decisively demonstrated the capabilities of black combat troops would remain largely unknown for decades, overshadowed by larger battles and obscured by an institutional reluctance to acknowledge achievements that challenged prevailing prejudices. But for the men who were there, both those who survived and those who gave their lives, the burning tanks served as undeniable proof of what they had always known. Courage, skill, and worth as a soldier were determined by character and training, not by race. As the Buffalo Soldiers began their withdrawal, the Italian and German commanders were left to reckon with the consequences of their underestimation. Colonel Esposito, standing amid the wreckage of his artillery battery, faced not only a significant tactical setback, but also a profound challenge to his assumptions. "They came through the ravine," he said to Major Weber, who had arrived to assess the damage, "a route we deemed impassable. And they destroyed 12 guns and 2 tanks," Weber added, his tone neutral, but his implication clear. Esposito looked at the still-burning hulk of a Panzer IV, its ammunition continuing to cook off periodically with sharp reports that echoed across the valley. "It seems I was mistaken about the 92nd. Weber nodded slightly. "It appears we both were." This acknowledgement, made among the smoking ruins of what had been a secure position just hours earlier, would never appear in any official report or history. Like so many truths of war, it remained a private reckoning, significant to those who experienced it, but invisible to the broader historical record. Yet even as the Buffalo Soldiers made their way back toward friendly lines, carrying their wounded and honoring their dead, the impact of their achievement was already being diminished in the communications moving up the chain of command. Their limited raid was noted as a supporting action in the larger context of the day's operations. Their destruction of 12 artillery pieces and 2 tanks reduced to a footnote in reports that emphasized activities on the main front. The truth of what happened when Italian commanders mocked black troops only to watch their tanks burn before dawn would wait decades before emerging from the shadows of classified documents and fading memories. But for those who were there, who navigated the impossible ravine and stood their ground against armored counterattack, no official recognition was necessary to validate what they had accomplished. They knew, and for a moment, so did their enemies. The document that had started it all, the orders for the flanking operation, would eventually be filed away in an archive, its significance unrecognized, until a historian researching the contributions of black soldiers in World War II stumbled upon it in 1967. By then, many of the participants had passed away or disappeared into civilian life, their extraordinary achievement unacknowledged by the country they had served. But Private Thomas Washington never forgot. He returned to Mississippi after the war, eventually becoming a high school history teacher. Each year, he would tell his students about a ravine in Italy, about tanks burning in the dawn light, and about men who proved their worth not because they needed to, but because that's who they were. Some stories, he told them, aren't found in history books. Some victories aren't celebrated with parades. But they matter all the same, and in a small classroom in Mississippi, the truth lived on. In the autumn of 1957, 13 years after the events in Italy, a military historian named Dr. Robert Williamson was researching material for a comprehensive history of the Fifth Army's Italian campaign. Working through boxes of classified documents recently made available to researchers, he came across a brief after-action report filed by a Major Robert Davis, attached to General Clark's headquarters during the winter of 1944. The report described an operation by elements of the 92nd Infantry Division that seemed surprisingly significant. The neutralization of an entire Italian artillery regiment through a flanking maneuver previously thought impossible. What caught Williamson's attention was not just the tactical accomplishment, but the unusually direct language Major Davis used in his assessment. The personnel of Companies B, C, and D of the 371st Infantry Regiment executed their mission with exceptional skill and courage, Davis had written. Their performance demonstrates conclusively that properly trained Negro combat units are the equal of any troops in the United States Army. Williamson was puzzled. If this operation had been as successful as described, why was it not better known? Why had it not appeared in any of the standard histories of the campaign? His curiosity piqued. He began searching for additional documentation. His inquiries led him to a retired Colonel Robert Davis, now living in Vermont. The former major had risen in rank before retiring in 1955, his career successful but not particularly distinguished. When Williamson contacted him about the Italian operation, Davis's response was illuminating. "I've been waiting for someone to ask about that for 13 years, Davis told him when they met at his home in Burlington. "I filed my report as ordered, recommended commendations for several officers and enlisted men, and then watched as the entire operation was essentially written out of the official narrative." "Why?" Williamson asked. Davis smiled without humor. "Because it contradicted what many in the high command wanted to believe about Negro troops. A narrative had already been established that they were unreliable under fire, suited primarily for support roles. The 371st's success was inconvenient to that narrative. But surely the destruction of an artillery regiment and 2 tanks couldn't be completely ignored. It wasn't ignored, Davis clarified. It was diminished. The official history acknowledges a limited raid that caused some damage to enemy artillery positions. The specifics, the ravine crossing thought impossible, the complete destruction of 12 howitzers, the defeat of armored counterattack, those details were omitted. Williamson took careful notes. "Do you have any personal records from the operation?" Davis hesitated, then went to a desk drawer and removed a small notebook. "I kept my own account, separate from my official report. I've never shown this to anyone. It names names, records conversations, documents the prejudice that these men faced from their own army, even as they were fighting and dying for it." The historian accepted the notebook with appropriate reverence. "May I ask what changed your mind about Negro troops? Your report suggests you arrived with certain expectations that were altered by what you witnessed." Davis looked out the window for a long moment before responding. "I was raised in Boston, in a family that considered itself progressive on racial matters. I thought I was enlightened, free from prejudice, but I realized in Italy that I still carried assumptions, unconscious expectations about what those men would be capable of in combat." He turned back to Williamson. "What changed my mind was watching a 19-year-old private from Mississippi take command of a bazooka after his gunner was killed, and destroy a German tank while wounded himself. Watching a sergeant from Detroit lead his men with the same skill and courage I'd seen in the best white NCOs I'd known." "This private," Williamson asked, "what was his name?" "Washington. Thomas Washington. He received a Silver Star for his actions that day, one of the few recognitions that actually made it through the system." Davis shook his head slightly. "He deserved more. They all did." Williamson spent several hours with Colonel Davis, recording his recollections and copying key pages from his personal notebook. When he left, he had the beginnings of what he believed could be an important historical correction, the true story of an operation that demonstrated the capabilities of black combat soldiers in World War II. What he couldn't have anticipated was the resistance he would encounter when attempting to publish his findings. His regular publisher, which had released his previous military histories, rejected the manuscript as too politically charged and not aligned with established historical consensus. Academic journals proved equally unreceptive, questioning his sources and methodology in ways they never had for his previous work. Frustrated but determined, Williamson eventually found a small publishing house willing to release his monograph, titled The Ravine, Black Soldiers and the Winter Offensive of 1944. The book appeared in 1962 to little attention and modest sales, primarily in academic circles. Most military historians dismissed it as revisionist, questioning whether the operation could possibly have been as significant as Williamson described. The breakthrough came in 1967, when Williamson was contacted by a journalist named Michael Harrington, who was researching a feature article on the Buffalo Soldiers of World War II for a national magazine. Harrington had come across Williamson's book and been intrigued enough to seek out additional sources. Using contacts in the Defense Department, Harrington located military records that corroborated key elements of Williamson's account. More importantly, he tracked down several veterans of the 371st Infantry Regiment who had participated in the operation, including Thomas Washington, now a high school history teacher in Jackson, Mississippi. Washington's account, recorded in a 3-hour interview, provided the human dimension that brought the operation to life. He described the ravine crossing, the artillery raid, and most vividly, the tank engagement in which he had earned his Silver Star. His recollections matched Colonel Davis's account with remarkable precision, adding details that only someone who had been there could have known. "We knew what people thought of us," Washington told Harrington. "The Italians, the Germans, even some of our own officers. We heard the broadcasts, saw the propaganda leaflets. They called us all kinds of names, said we wouldn't stand and fight." He smiled slightly. "After we destroyed those tanks, nobody was laughing anymore." Harrington's article, published in July 1968, brought the operation to public attention for the first time. Titled The Tanks That Burned at Dawn, it presented the story of the Buffalo Soldiers' achievement alongside the subsequent minimization of their accomplishment in official histories. The article sparked controversy in military circles, but was widely read and discussed amid the broader civil rights conversations of the late 1960s. For Robert Williamson, the article represented vindication. His research, initially dismissed, was now being taken seriously by a wider audience. He continued his work, locating additional veterans of the operation and recording their testimonies before time claimed them. In 1969, 25 years after the operation, a reunion was held in Detroit, organized by former Sergeant Marcus Johnson. 15 veterans of the 3 companies attended, along with Colonel Davis, Dr. Williamson, and Michael Harrington. They shared memories, honored those who had not survived the war or the subsequent decades, and collectively reconstructed an achievement that official history had largely overlooked. It was at this reunion that Johnson revealed he had kept his own records as well, not just memories, but actual documents. As a company sergeant, he had maintained a small notebook recording key events, casualties, and accomplishments of his men. After the war, concerned that the true story of the operation might be lost, he had typed up his notes, made copies, and distributed them to several trusted friends for safekeeping. These documents, combined with Colonel Davis's notebook, Thomas Washington's testimony, and the recollections of other veterans, provided Williamson with enough material to publish a revised and expanded edition of his book in 1971. This time, with the civil rights movement having shifted public consciousness and created more receptivity to stories of black achievement, the book found a wider audience. Military historians who had previously dismissed Williamson's work now engaged with it more seriously, some acknowledging that the traditional narratives of the Italian campaign had indeed minimized or omitted the contributions of black combat units. Younger historians, less invested in defending established interpretations, began incorporating the operation into their own work on World War II. For the veterans themselves, this belated recognition brought a measure of satisfaction, though many remained bitter about the years of silence and the honors never bestowed. Thomas Washington, speaking at a Black History Month event at his high school in 1972, expressed this mixed sentiment. "We didn't fight for recognition," he told his students and assembled guests. "We fought because it was our duty, and because we loved this country even when it didn't love us back. But truth matters, history matters, and for too long, our truth was buried, our history denied." The full story of the Buffalo Soldiers who crossed an impossible ravine and burned enemy tanks before dawn would never achieve the prominence of better-known World War II operations. It remained a specialized knowledge, familiar to scholars of African-American military history, but absent from most general histories and textbooks. Yet for those who knew the story, it served as a powerful corrective to narratives that had long diminished the contributions and capabilities of black soldiers. It demonstrated not only their courage and skill in combat, but also the institutional barriers that had prevented their achievements from being fully recognized and celebrated. In 1997, more than 50 years after the operation, the Defense Department officially acknowledged the historical significance of the action, adding a brief account to the Army's official history of the Italian campaign. The amendment noted that elements of the 92nd Infantry Division had executed a successful flanking operation, resulting in the destruction of enemy artillery assets and armored vehicles, demonstrating exceptional tactical proficiency. This modest correction came too late for many of the participants. Colonel Davis had passed away in 1983, Sergeant Johnson in 1989. Thomas Washington lived to see the acknowledgement, though at 72 his health was failing. When informed of the Army's action, he reportedly remarked, "Better late than never, I suppose." But the men who died that day deserved better. The most enduring legacy of the operation was perhaps not the belated official recognition, but the way it had been preserved and transmitted through unofficial channels, through the personal records of participants, through Williamson's persistent scholarship, through Washington's classroom lessons to generations of students in Mississippi. It demonstrated that history isn't always found in official documents or sanctioned narratives. Sometimes it lives in personal memories, in private notebooks, in stories told by those who were there and who refused to let their truth be erased. The tanks that burned before dawn had long since rusted away on an Italian hillside. The men who destroyed them had mostly returned to dust as well. But the truth of what they accomplished against both enemy forces and the prejudices of their own society continued to burn bright for those who cared to see it. In truth, the most significant victories are often those that change minds rather than capture territory. By that measure, the Buffalo Soldiers who navigated the impossible ravine in the winter of 1944 may have won a more important victory than they ever realized. The military archives held many secrets over the decades following World War II. Some were classified for legitimate national security reasons, while others remained hidden due to more problematic motivations: the protection of reputations, the maintenance of comfortable narratives, the concealment of prejudice and its consequences. The story of the Buffalo Soldiers and the burning tanks was one of many that fell into this latter category, its suppression a reflection of an institution and a society not yet ready to fully acknowledge the equal humanity and capability of all its citizens. In the spring of 2003, nearly 60 years after the operation, a military archivist named Dr. Elaine Carter was digitizing records from the Italian campaign when she discovered something unusual: a collection of photographs that had been misfiled for decades, separated from their identifying documents and context. The black and white images showed the aftermath of what appeared to be a significant engagement, destroyed artillery pieces, the burned-out hulks of what military vehicle experts later identified as Panzer IV tanks, and most notably, black American soldiers moving among the wreckage. The photographs had evidently been taken by a military photographer assigned to document the operation, but had somehow become separated from Major Davis's report and the other records of the action. Dr. Carter, recognizing the potential historical significance of the images, began searching for information that might provide context. Her research led her to Williamson's book, now long out of print, but available in university libraries. Through this connection, she eventually contacted Thomas Washington's son, Michael, who had preserved his father's papers after the elder Washington's death in 1999. The photographs, finally reunited with the narrative they illustrated, provided visual confirmation of what veterans had described: the destroyed artillery battery, the burning tanks, the black soldiers who had accomplished what many thought impossible. They were published in a military history journal in 2004, accompanied by an article that synthesized the various sources now available on the operation. For the first time, the general public could see the evidence of what had previously existed primarily in written accounts and fading memories. The impact of these images was significant, offering visible proof that challenged any remaining skepticism about the scale or significance of the operation. In 2010, the last known surviving participant of the operation, a former private named William Turner, who had served in Company C, gave his final interview to an oral history project focused on black veterans. At 95 years old, his memories of specific details had faded, but certain moments remained vivid. The freezing water in the ravine, the sound of the tanks approaching, the expressions on the faces of captured Italian artillerymen who had not expected to see black soldiers emerging from what they thought was an impassable route. "They looked at us like we were ghosts," Turner recalled. "I guess in a way we were, ghosts of all their assumptions about what we couldn't do." Turner passed away 3 months after giving this interview, taking with him the last living memory of the operation. But by then, the story had been documented, verified, and preserved through multiple sources: official records, personal accounts, scholarly research, and finally, photographic evidence. In 2015, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Jenkins produced a short film titled Before Dawn, which reconstructed the operation through interviews with historians, archival footage, and dramatic recreations of key moments. The film received limited distribution, but was shown at several film festivals and incorporated into educational materials about African American military history. Jenkins's research for the film uncovered one final piece of the puzzle: a letter written by Colonel Esposito to his family in Italy, dated 2 weeks after the operation. In this personal correspondence, the Italian officer reflected on his encounter with the Buffalo Soldiers in terms far more respectful than his earlier dismissive comments. "We faced American Negro troops recently," Esposito wrote, "and I must confess they fought with skill and determination that would honor any nation's army. They executed a brilliant flanking maneuver through terrain we had judged impassable. And when our armor counterattacked, they destroyed both tanks with precision fire." Military reality often contradicts political rhetoric, and in this case, the reality is that these men are formidable soldiers. This private acknowledgement, never intended for public consumption, provided a poignant counterpoint to the official minimization of the Buffalo Soldiers' achievement. That Esposito could recognize their worth as soldiers, while many in their own command structure could not, was perhaps the most telling commentary on the prejudices of the era. The story of the Buffalo Soldiers, the impossible ravine, and the tanks that burned before dawn would never achieve the prominence of Normandy, Iwo Jima, or other celebrated World War II engagements. It remained a specialized knowledge, familiar to scholars of African American military history, but absent from most general histories and textbooks. Yet for those who did know the story, it served as a powerful reminder of both the contributions Black Americans have made to their country's defense and the long struggle for those contributions to be fully recognized and respected. It demonstrated that courage, skill, and worth as a soldier are determined by character and training, not by race. A truth that should have been self-evident but required the blood and sacrifice of those Buffalo Soldiers to illuminate. In a sense, the most lasting victory of those men who navigated the ravine and faced down enemy tanks was not the ground they took or the equipment they destroyed, but the minds they changed, both then and in the decades that followed, as their story gradually emerged from the shadows of suppressed history. And perhaps that is why the story matters still, not just as a historical correction, but as a reminder that the struggle for recognition and respect is itself a form of valor, as worthy of honor as any battlefield courage. The Buffalo Soldiers fought two wars simultaneously, one against foreign enemies and another against the prejudices of their own society. That they persevered in both is their enduring legacy. The tanks burned before dawn on a winter morning in 1944. The truth smoldered for decades before finally catching fire in the consciousness of a nation still learning to recognize the full humanity and worth of all its citizens. Both conflagrations illuminated realities that some preferred to keep in darkness, and both serve as beacons for those still navigating their own impossible ravines. Did you enjoy this story? Your support helps us continue producing new documentaries. A like, a comment, or a share makes all the difference. See more historical cases on our channel, and if you're not yet subscribed, join our community. I'll see you in the next episode.